Nadine Carter had always trusted Greg, her husband of 8 years. She had trusted Valerie Pierce, her best friend of even longer. But trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered, impossible to repair. The moment she discovered the affair, the moment she saw undeniable proof that Greg and Valerie had betrayed her, something inside her broke. And as she stood in the dim glow of her bedroom, staring at the message that changed everything, one thought consumed her. They wouldn't get away with this. Nadine Holloway had always believed she had a solid marriage. She and her husband, Greg, had been together for 10 years, building a life that felt secure and fulfilling. They had met in college, fallen in love quickly, and never looked back. Their relationship had survived the ups and downs of life, and by all appearances, they were the kind of couple others admired. Nadine worked as a social worker, dedicating her life to helping others, while Greg was a financial analyst with a stable career. Their days were filled with routines, morning coffee, long work hours, occasional date nights, and weekend gatherings with friends. Life was predictable but comfortable. Among their circle of friends, Valerie Knox stood out. She and Nadine had been best friends since college, an inseparable pair who had supported each other through everything. Valerie had been there when Nadine started dating Greg, had helped plan their wedding, and had even given a heartfelt speech about their love. Unlike Nadine, Valerie had never settled down. She was adventurous, always chasing new experiences, and claimed she wasn't interested in marriage or children. While Nadine had embraced a life of stability, Valerie had taken the opposite route, moving from job to job and relationship to relationship. Despite their differences, Nadine had never once questioned Valerie's loyalty. She trusted her completely. Valerie was more than just a friend. She was family. She had a key to their house, spent holidays with them, and was the person Nadine turned to for advice. If anything ever went wrong, Nadine knew Valerie would be there to help pick up the pieces. Their friendship had been a constant in her life, unshaken by time or circumstances. Things began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. Greg's behavior changed first. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things that felt off. He started working late more often. His phone was always in his hand, and he seemed more distant. When Nadine asked if something was wrong, he brushed it off, blaming work stress and exhaustion. She wanted to believe him, but the feeling of unease lingered. Valerie, too, began acting differently. She canceled plans more frequently, seemed distracted whenever they talked, and started avoiding deep conversations. Nadine noticed she had been going to the doctor more often, but when she asked about it, Valerie dismissed it as nothing serious. There was no reason to suspect anything unusual, yet something didn't sit right. A gut feeling, a whisper of doubt, crept into Nadine's mind. She tried to silence it, convincing herself that she was overthinking. Then there were the small details that, on their own, didn't mean much, but together formed a pattern Nadine couldn't ignore. Greg had always been the type to leave his phone lying around, never caring if she saw his messages. Now he took it with him everywhere. He had changed his passcode, something he had never done before. Valerie, who used to drop by their house unannounced, had suddenly stopped coming over altogether. If they did see each other, it was brief, as if she was trying to avoid any real interaction. Nadine tried to dismiss her concerns, reminding herself that Greg loved her and that Valerie would never betray her. But the doubt wouldn't go away. A seed had been planted, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, it continued to grow. Something was happening, something she wasn't seeing clearly yet. She told herself that she was imagining things, but deep down she already knew the truth. She just wasn't ready to face it. Nadine could no longer ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The changes in Greg's behavior had started subtly, but now they were impossible to overlook. He had always been affectionate, always made time for her despite his busy work schedule. But now, he barely touched her. Their once lively conversations had turned into brief exchanges about groceries, bills, and meaningless small talk. The warmth in his eyes had faded, replaced by a cold distance that made her feel like she was living with a stranger. He had new habits she didn't recognize. He spent more time on his appearance, wearing cologne even on days he wasn't leaving the house. His phone was practically an extension of his hand, and he never let it out of his sight. When it buzzed, he would quickly glance at it, type a response, then set it back down with an expression that made Nadine's stomach tighten. She didn't want to be the kind of wife who snooped through her husband's things, but the thought crossed her mind more times than she wanted to admit. At night, he would turn away from her in bed, claiming he was too tired. When they did make love, it felt distant, mechanical, like he was fulfilling an obligation rather than being with the woman he loved. Nadine had tried to convince herself that this was just a phase. Work stress, maybe, midlife anxiety, something temporary. But as the weeks passed, the tension between them only grew worse. It wasn't just Greg. Valerie had changed, too. She was more withdrawn, avoiding their usual coffee dates and coming up with excuses whenever Nadine tried to make plans. When they did see each other, she seemed nervous, her eyes darting around as if she couldn't meet Nadine's gaze. She laughed less, and when she did, it felt forced, almost rehearsed. Nadine noticed something else. Valerie had been making frequent doctor's visits. It started sporadically but had become more frequent over time. When Nadine asked if she was okay, Valerie dismissed it with a vague answer, saying it was nothing serious. But something didn't add up. Valerie had never been secretive before. She used to share every detail of her life, from bad dates to embarrassing work stories, but now she was guarded, careful with her words. One evening, Greg came home later than usual. Nadine had been waiting, pretending to read a book while listening, for the sound of his car in the driveway. When he finally walked through the door, she could tell something was off. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, and there was the faintest trace of lipstick on his collar, so faint that he probably hadn't noticed it himself. Her stomach turned, but she said nothing. She watched him walk past her, mumbling something about being exhausted before disappearing into the shower. She felt like a fool. How long had this been going on? Was she imagining things? Or was there really something happening right in front of her? She wanted to believe that Greg was still the man she married, that he would never betray her. But her instincts were screaming at her, and for the first time, she decided to listen. A few days later, she found the proof she had been dreading. While doing laundry, she emptied the pockets of Greg's work jacket and found a crumpled receipt. It was from a luxury hotel downtown, dated on a night he had told her he was working late. Her hands trembled as she stared at it, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She didn't need to see more. She already knew. Her best friend and her husband were hiding something from her. And whatever it was about to destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. Nadine felt like she was suffocating under the weight of her suspicions. The hotel receipt was undeniable proof that Greg had been lying, but she still didn't know the full extent of his betrayal. The logical part of her mind told her she needed more evidence before confronting him, but deep down she already knew the truth. A sinking feeling in her stomach told her that Valerie was involved, but she didn't want to believe it. The thought of her best friend being the other woman was too painful to accept. Over the next few days, she became more observant, taking note of every little thing Greg did. His late nights, his secretive phone calls, the way he avoided looking her in the eyes, it all pointed to something sinister. He wasn't just distracted, he was hiding something. Every time he left the house, she wondered if he was really going to work or if he was meeting someone. Every time he smiled at her, she wondered if it was all an act. The tension between them had grown unbearable. Greg barely spoke to her anymore unless it was absolutely necessary. He spent more time locked in his office, claiming he had extra work to do. When he did emerge, he was distant, his mind clearly elsewhere. Nadine's presence no longer seemed to matter to him. It was as if she had become invisible in her own home. She knew she needed answers, but she wasn't sure how to get them. Confronting Greg without solid proof could backfire. He would deny everything, make her feel like she was crazy for suspecting him. And Valerie? What if she was innocent? What if there was some other explanation for her behavior? The thought of falsely accusing her best friend made Nadine hesitate. Then fate handed her an opportunity she couldn't ignore. One afternoon, Greg left his phone unattended on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. It was a rare moment. He was usually so careful about keeping it with him. Nadine hesitated, her heart pounding as she stared at the screen. She had never gone through his phone before. It felt like a violation, but after everything, didn't she have the right to know the truth? With trembling hands, she unlocked it. Greg had changed his passcode recently, but she had memorized it when she saw him enter it one night. She quickly navigated to his messages, her breath catching in her throat when she saw a conversation with a contact saved as V. Her fingers felt ice cold as she clicked on the messages. The thread was filled with late-night conversations, flirtatious messages, and worst of all, plans to meet in secret. The texts were undeniable. Valerie wasn't just involved with Greg. They had been seeing each other for months. Nadine scrolled further, her vision blurring as she read messages that made her stomach churn. Mentions of hotel rooms, whispered promises, and then the final blow, Valerie talking about doctor's visits, her worries about how he would react once the truth came out. Nadine's mind raced. Doctor's visits, Greg's strange behavior. The pieces fell into place with crushing certainty. Valerie was pregnant, and the baby, there was no doubt in Nadine's mind, it was Greg's. The phone nearly slipped from her hands as she tried to process the enormity of what she had just discovered. Her husband and her best friend had betrayed her in the worst possible way. They hadn't just broken her trust, they had shattered her entire world. She felt sick. The walls of her home, the place she had built with Greg, now felt like a prison, closing in around her. She had spent years believing in their marriage, trusting Greg, cherishing her friendship with Valerie. And now, it had all been a lie. Rage bubbled up inside her, overwhelming the sadness that had first taken hold. They had made a fool of her. They had lied to her face while sneaking around behind her back. And now, there was a child involved. Nadine didn't know what she was going to do next, but one thing was certain. Greg and Valerie wouldn't get away with this. Nadine's hands shook as she placed Greg's phone back where she found it. Her heart pounded so hard that she could hear it in her ears. The truth had been sitting in front of her all along, hidden in small moments, stolen glances, and quiet betrayals. Now that she had undeniable proof, the weight of it pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She spent the rest of the day moving through the house in a daze, going through the motions of daily life as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Every time she looked at Greg, she saw the lies, the deceit, and the secret he had been keeping from her. Every time her phone buzzed with a message from Valerie, she felt sick, knowing that the woman who was supposed to be her best friend had stabbed her in the back. Greg, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her, went about his usual routine. He kissed her on the cheek before leaving for work, his touch feeling foreign and unwelcome. He sat across from her at dinner, scrolling through his phone while she silently wondered if he was texting Valerie. At night, he slept beside her, breathing steadily while she lay awake, consumed by anger and betrayal. Nadine knew she couldn't let this go. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine while Greg continued his affair. But she also knew that confronting him in a fit of rage wouldn't get her the justice she deserved. If she wanted to make him pay, she had to be smart. She had to wait for the perfect moment. Over the next few days, she watched them both more closely than ever. Greg continued his secretive behavior, and Valerie kept her distance, as if she suspected that Nadine was on to her. But Nadine played her part well. She didn't let on that she knew anything. She responded to Greg's lies with forced smiles and acted as if she believed the excuses Valerie gave for canceling plans. She was careful not to raise suspicion, all while gathering every bit of evidence she could. She took screenshots of Greg's messages with Valerie and saved them in a private folder on her phone. She noted the times he left the house and matched them with the days Valerie had her supposed doctor's appointments. She even followed Greg one evening when he claimed he had to stay late at work. He didn't go to the office. Instead, he drove straight to Valerie's house, slipping inside like he had done it 100 times before. Nadine sat in her car outside, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The betrayal felt even more real. Now that she had seen it with her own eyes, she wanted to storm inside, scream at both of them, and expose their lies. But she forced herself to stay calm. If she lost control now, she wouldn't get the revenge she wanted. The final piece of her plan came together when she reached out to Valerie's ex-boyfriend, Daniel. He and Valerie had ended things badly years ago, but Nadine knew he still held a grudge. When she told him about Valerie's affair with Greg and the pregnancy, he was furious. She didn't have to convince him to help her. He was more than willing to make sure that Valerie's secret was exposed in the most humiliating way possible. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Nadine finally made her move. She sent a message to Greg from an anonymous number, pretending to be someone who had found out about his affair. She told him to meet at a cafe downtown if he wanted to keep it quiet. At the same time, Daniel sent a similar message to Valerie, pretending to be someone who knew about her pregnancy. Greg and Valerie arrived separately, both looking nervous as they searched for the person who had contacted them. They didn't realize that they had walked into a trap. Hidden cameras captured every moment as they panicked, trying to figure out who had discovered their secret. Nadine watched from a distance, satisfaction growing inside her. The first part of her plan had worked. Now it was time to make sure their lives fell apart just as they had ruined hers. Greg and Valerie sat across from each other in the cafe, their faces pale and tense. They exchanged frantic whispers, both trying to figure out who had exposed them. Greg glanced around nervously, scanning the cafe for anyone suspicious, while Valerie fidgeted with the napkin in her hands. Their paranoia was on full display, and Nadine watched it all unfold from a parked car across the street. She had spent weeks planning this moment. Every detail had been carefully arranged to ensure maximum humiliation. The hidden cameras recorded everything: their panic, their guilt, the way they tried to convince each other that no one knew their secret. But they were wrong. Someone did know. And soon, everyone else would too. Back at home, Nadine uploaded the footage to an anonymous social media account. The video went live with a caption that left no room for doubt. Husband caught cheating with wife's best friend, and she's pregnant. Within hours, the video was being shared across multiple platforms, gaining traction as people speculated about the identities of the two people in the footage. Nadine didn't have to say a word. Social media did the work for her. The fallout was immediate. Greg received a flood of calls and messages from friends, co-workers, and even his boss. His perfect reputation was shattered in an instant. The man who had once been seen as responsible and devoted was now the subject of whispers and cruel jokes. Valerie's situation was even worse. Her workplace was flooded with messages from people who had seen the video. The gossip spread like wildfire, turning her into a spectacle. Greg came home that evening in a panic. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing, and his face was tight with fear. Nadine waited for him in the living room, arms crossed, calm but ready. When he saw her, his expression shifted from panic to realization. He knew she was behind it. But before he could speak, she handed him a folder filled with divorce papers, bank statements, and evidence of his affair. She had already met with a lawyer. She had already secured everything she needed: their house, their savings. Greg was about to lose it all. She had arranged things so that he would walk away with nothing but his guilt. She wanted him to feel the same emptiness that she had felt when she discovered the truth. Greg tried to talk his way out of it, but Nadine had no interest in hearing his excuses. She had already heard enough lies. With one final glance at him, she walked away, leaving him to face the consequences alone. Valerie's world crumbled even faster. She became the target of relentless online backlash. Strangers dissected her actions, calling her every name imaginable. Her family, humiliated by the exposure, cut ties with her. She had no one left to turn to, not even Greg, who had no desire to support her now that his own life had been ruined. A few weeks later, Nadine watched from a distance as Greg moved out of their home, stuffing his belongings into a small suitcase. He looked exhausted, broken, like a man who had lost everything. She felt no sympathy. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. Valerie, now publicly disgraced, disappeared from social circles. The last Nadine heard, she had left town, unable to handle the shame. For the first time in months, Nadine felt free. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but she no longer carried the weight of it alone. She had taken back control. She had made sure that Greg and Valerie paid for what they had done. And now, as she stood in the doorway of her home, watching the sunset on the life she once knew, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace.